Well, I'm Dr. Bill Morgan. I'm a retired physician, first pediatric residency and then an allergy fellowship and practice here, and started Arizona Asthma and Allergy back in 1980, and I retired about 4 years ago. So I stayed home about a year and was getting thoroughly bored with myself. And the big mistake I made was thinking I'll help my wife out and reorganize her kitchen. Ah, bad mistake. So at that point, I applied to and entered a master's in counseling psychology program and graduated, and I work part-time for Touchstone Behavioral Health in their infant early childhood program, and I function as a therapist. So, Dr. Bob Roden asked me to do this lecture because, as you well know, we have one circle over here, and this is behavioral health. We have another circle over here, and that's science. And you probably have noticed in your literature and other conferences, these two are starting to come together and explain each other, which is really cool. So, with my science background and interest in this, Dr. Bob asked me if I would put this together and just try to make some sense out of it for you. Now, we're going to cover attachment, circle of security, and things like that. We're going to talk about ACEs, which I'm sure you all know. But what I want you to take away from today are concepts. When we get to the neuroscience, if I see you falling asleep, I see your eyes rolling, let me know, or I'll try to redirect it so it makes sense to you, okay? So, of course, the father of all this is Dr. John Bowlby. And his father was a surgeon. He was raised in an upper middle class English family. And so he had nannies most of his young life. And in fact, at 4 years of age, his mother figure, his nanny, left. And he describes that as one of the real traumas in his life. Then at 6 years of age, there's tradition in the upper class in England, you go to boarding school. Another separation. So he became very interested in separations and the effect on children because he had experienced it himself. So of interest, he went to medical school and the Institute for Psychoanalysis concurrently. I don't know how someone does that, but nevertheless, he did. I think you're all aware of his student, his disciple, Mary Ainsworth. She obtained a PhD at the University of Toronto. She was married, her husband's job changed, and they went to London. So she answers an ad in the paper for somebody who needed a research assistant. Well, lo and behold, it's Bowlby. So she spends 3.5 years with him. And during this time, she developed a secure base exploration theory. Her husband's job changed again, and they went to Uganda. And she was doing the same sort of work and doing home visits, and really started to cement her theories. And then in 56, her husband's job changed again. They moved to Johns Hopkins, where he taught, and she was on faculty, mainly teaching classes. Eventually, she got the slot to do research. Then it's from that she developed the strange situation test or procedure. And the reason she did that was I know you do home visits. How many of you do home visits? Okay. At Touchstone, excuse me, about 90% of what we do is home visits. And there's nothing like walking in a home to really get a sense of what these folks are living with. And so she developed a strange situation so that she could control the variables and then make some solid research and make sense out of it. So I want to talk a little bit about a subject that's of interest to me, and that is, what about prenatal bonding before we even start talking about attachment? So we know that pregnancy will activate the mother's internalized relationship with her own mother. And just as the infant's biological drive is to attach, so is a strong drive from the mother to provide care for the young, and that's called bonding. So mothers bond, babies attach, but it's really the same thing. So the pregnancy, thoughts about pre-pregnancy and first trimester are really an amalgam, a mixture of the mother's projections, hopes, dreams, attributions, and unconscious fantasies. That goes really well till about the second trimester when you feel quickening or the baby starts kicking. And then all of a sudden it's like, wow, not only is my tummy getting bigger, but there's something in me, there's life. And the third trimester, the mother now can imagine what her baby's going to be like and what she'll be like as a mother, and it gets more real world based. So women with balanced adaptations and representations during pregnancy are more likely to have secure infants at 1 year. Or a woman's attachment security predicts her maternal fetal attachment. Does that make sense? So, what are the risk factors? Obviously, if you have a prior psychiatric issue, depression, anxiety, serious mental illness, have you had substance abuse, or are you currently early and ongoing trauma, domestic violence, PTSD, that kind of thing? Unplanned or unwanted pregnancy. And certainly because of that, you probably have poverty and financial issues. So we know that postpartum depression occurs about in 10 to 15% of pregnancies. And it's due to stress issues, lack of sleep, hormonal issues, attitudes, beliefs, and again, a prior history of a mood disorder. But it's pretty common for, in 60 to 80%, to sort of have that little blues. You've gone through 9 months of hard work to deliver the baby, and now you finally have the baby home, and I think it's reasonable that there's a letdown. And you, not just mentally, but I mean, physically, your body's really adapting and trying to get back to what you were pre-pregnancy. Now, another risk factor, as you all know, is teen pregnancy. And one of the problems with teen pregnancy is they go through their development, their psychosocial sexual development. At the same time now, they're entering motherhood. And this is almost, and I can see it's overwhelming to do that. And then so many of these teen pregnancies do not have a father present in the home. They do not have the financial resources. They're usually often school dropouts. And it pretty much can, unless that pregnant mom has got a really good support system, she has pretty much guaranteed she and her baby's life in poverty. Now, that doesn't happen all the time, but if you fit those parameters, it probably will. Well, let's talk about fathers. I don't think we talk enough about them. So the father's relationship with his own father affects his attachment to the infant, because that's his own template for being a father. And you can certainly understand if you were raised in a home without a father or a father figure, we know that those folks have a much higher incidence of aggression, school dropouts. And the bottom line is they don't learn to control their impulses. And one of the roles of a good father is to really not only demonstrate, but coach and let that adolescent know what behavior is acceptable, what's not. So fathers play an incredibly important role. So also the father, just like the mother, has reflective functioning, and that is imagining what is my baby going to be, what's it going to be like, it'll have a mind of its own, and yet, I have this kid, but I also have my life. So, let me see. We're going to probably pause this for a moment. For those of you that weren't here when we came in, hi Zach, we're ready to start.
Yeah, go ahead and dance one more time, see if it works.
Just click here.
Do the right arrow on the keyboard.
Oh.
Or you can use the remote that I have for you. That will still work.
Well, we went.
I think you went 2.
Okay.
Let's try clicking on it with that mouse.
Which one?
Is that one of the videos we had pulled up?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let me play it up here. And then we'll resume your presentation in just a moment.
Okay. So this is my problem. I was supposed to bring a special adapter for my Apple. I didn't.
Secure attachment video?
Yes. So anyway, we're having to do it on a PC that doesn't quite always
play as nice. That's different, but there. I'll turn it up.
Not all children react the same way. Some don't really seem to have a strong bond with their caregiver, and some kids don't display stranger anxiety at all. In order to study this behavior and to learn why some children might deviate from the normal pattern, Mary Ainsworth created what she referred to as the strange situation. And here's how it would work. A mother, pictured here in orange, and the child, pictured here in yellow, would enter a room in a place that they hadn't been before, in this case a psychology lab. In the room was a stranger who was actually part of the experiment, and they're pictured here in blue. And for the first part of the experiment, the mother would just sit in a chair and let their child explore the room. And I should note here that I'm saying mother and not parent or caregiver, because mother-child interactions are what the research has primarily focused on. And this isn't to say that a child can't form a strong bond with another parent or with a different caregiver, but here we're just going to be talking about mother-child relationships. And so we have a mother and we have a stranger, and both of them are sitting in a room with the child, but neither is interacting with the child. At some point during the experiment, the mother would get up and leave the room. And she would try to do this without calling too much attention to herself. So she wouldn't walk over her child and say goodbye. Instead, she would simply get up quietly and leave. And so the baby is left alone with the stranger. And after a certain amount of time, the mother returns to the room. And so we have the experiment exactly as we started it, with both the mother and the stranger in the room with the child. And okay, so that's kind of a weird situation. What exactly were the researchers looking for when they set this up? Well, for the first part of the experiment, They wanted to see whether or not the child would explore the space while the mother was present. So would they get up and walk and play with all the toys, or would they be more reserved and cling to the mother? The second thing that they're looking at is how the child responds when the mother leaves. Does the child start crying when they realize that the mother is gone, or do they keep on playing? And lastly, they were looking at how the child reacted to the mother after the mother returned to the room. So were they happy about her return, were they sad upon her return, or did they just ignore her altogether? And after looking at the data, researchers found that they could split children into two main groups: those with a secure attachment and those with an insecure attachment. A majority of kids, about 60% of them, demonstrated what was referred to as a secure attachment. And this meant a couple of different things. First of all, the child felt comfortable to explore the room. And maybe they stayed next to their mother for the first couple of minutes that they were in the room, but eventually the child felt comfortable enough to move around and explore. And there were times while the child was playing that they might look to the mother or they might walk back to them. But in general, these children felt comfortable to explore the room on their own. But when the parent left, it was a different story. The children became really upset. They became really distressed when they noticed her absence. However, that distress tended to go away once the mother returned. And when she returned, the children would typically go to her. They really wanted contact with her. Insecurely attached children showed some different behaviors. When these children were first brought into the room, they tended to cling to their mother just like the securely attached children did. However, unlike the securely attached children, the insecurely attached children tended to stay with their mother. They tended not to explore the room. And just like the securely attached children, when the mother left, the children became really upset. However, unlike the securely attached children, that distress didn't really end once the mother returned. They were upset when she went away, but they weren't soothed by her presence. Other insecurely attached children even showed avoidant behaviors, meaning that they weren't actually upset when the mother left the room, and they were kind of indifferent to her when she returned. And so now that we know that these two different styles of attachment exist, the next question is why? What might be responsible for these differences? What might cause some infants to be securely attached, while other infants are insecurely attached? So when researchers started to look deeper into why kids develop different kinds of attachment, they found that parenting style had a lot to do with it. Mothers who were sensitive and responsive to their infants tended to have children who exhibited a secure attachment. Mothers who came across as insensitive or unresponsive to their children's needs tended to form insecure attachments, which I'll represent here by putting a lot of space between the mother and the child. And that's not to say that the parents of insecurely attached children were behaving in any way that would be considered to be really inappropriate. There isn't really any child abuse or serious neglect going on here. These mothers would attend to their children, much like their securely attached peers, but they tended to ignore them at other times. And this is something that you can probably see for yourself if you go out and observe some parent-child interactions. One thing that you could look for is how often is a parent looking at their phone when their child is trying to get their attention. And that's not to say that checking your phone is bad, or will damage your children in some way. The only question here seems to be how long were they checking their phone for? And do they continue to look at it even as their child is trying to get their attention? Another question that you might have is whether or not any of this actually matters. Does it really make that much of a difference whether or not a child is upset when a mother enters or leaves a room? Does this really have any long-term effects on a person after childhood? And interestingly enough, the answer seems to be yes. Some research seems to indicate that our early attachment style forms the basis of our adult relationships later in life, specifically as it relates to our comfort with affection and intimacy. So individuals who are securely attached as children tend to be securely attached in their adult relationships as well. They feel secure in their partner's love, and they feel that they can trust them. And they really gain a lot of comfort and security from that. Individuals who are insecurely attached as children tend to be insecure and anxious about their relationships when they're adults. Or they might try to avoid being too attached to any one person. And even more interesting than this is the fact that our attachment style as infants seems to affect the relationships that we have with our own children. So individuals who had a secure attachment with their parents tend to have a secure attachment with their kids as well. And individuals who had an insecure attachment with their parents tend to also have children who are insecurely attached. And take a moment to think about the implications of this, because this research seems to indicate that how comfortable we feel with our parents in our first year of life continues to affect us all the way through adulthood.
Okay.
Let's start with something else. But
Welcome to this Brain Shark on the importance of attachment.
Is that the same video?
No.
Here you see me, Dr. Lisa Firestone,
So we can-
Director of Research and Education for the Glendon Association. The Glendon Association provides good psychological information for professionals, and our sister website, PsychAlive, provides good psychological information for the
Is it
general
just the
public.
one video for right now?
Mhm.
So let's talk about attachment
which
theory.
slide was
Attachment
that?
theory was originally developed by Sir John Bowlby,
Only a few in.
and he got interested in attachment for two reasons. One is that when he was a small child, he was raised by a nanny, coming from an upper crust British family, and when he was 4 years old, his nanny was fired,
Okay.
and he lost his main
So,
attachment
Is that-
source of security.
Did you want to use this?
The other reason is
yeah.
that in England during World War
So,
II, when London was being bombed, and
The
many
bottom line is, are you
of the cities
secure
were
or
in the
insecure? And
countryside.
if you're
And yet,
insecure,
they did not
it's
do well
anxious
being
or
separate.
avoidant. Insecure, disorganized attachment was conceived by Mary Main, who was a student of Ainsworth. And the disorganized attachment we'll talk about in a moment, but it's very rare. And then the one that's even more rare is reactive attachment disorder. And we can talk about that. What they found was mothers who gave the most care and consistent care usually had infants with secure attachment. Mothers who aren't present had infants generally with insecure attachments. So the functions of attachment are to provide a sense of security and safety by the mother as she responds to the infant's distress signals. So the two of them begin to regulate the affect of the other by transactional patterns of regulation. It's like a dialogue, it's a dance. How many of you are mothers? Okay, so you have experienced that dance, and you're still experiencing it, because it goes on the rest of your life. Trust me, I got adult children, grandchildren, and it still is a constant phenomenon. Oops. So this little chart just gives you a very quick sense of if you have the mother, the child, and their working model with each other. If there's positivity and the child's loved, this is a secure attachment. If this child is unloved and rejected, if the mother is saying negative things, acting negatively, then it's an avoidant. And if the mother is angry and confused and gives very confusing signals to the child, then you have the anxious resistant or the ambivalent one. I apologize for this chart, and you probably can't read it in your handout, but this is just a summary of what we just talked about. So by 3 years of age, the attachment classification is a template for future relationships. Attachment classifications can change with healthy, positive environments or with negative environments. The parent's attachment style prior to the baby's birth predicts the infant attachment at 1 year of age, 70% of the time. So really, so much gets accomplished in that first year. So what do these kids look like when they grow up? Well, the secure kid is content, engaged on task, is a pleasure to have in your classroom. The avoidant one is withdrawn, quiet, and anxious. And for some teachers, for example, they're like, that kid always sits in the back, never asks a question, never a problem. What a relief to have a kid like that. Well, he or she really isn't engaged. And then with the anxious one, they're not focused, they're insecure. This is the kid who's always got his hand up asking questions, needs that affirmation. And then if you have a disorganized one, they're really trouble. Angry, depressed, not following directions. They have a very short fuse, difficulty with peer relationships. One of the families I had a couple of years ago, the mother was a borderline personality, and she would come home from work, and her son got home about that time too from elementary school, and she would rip into him about the most minute stuff. It was hardly, "How was your day at school, honey?" before it started. And he would dissociate, and then finally he'd run to his bedroom and slam the door shut. But at school, he was this disorganized personality, and he had an IEP, and that wasn't working. And then they were talking about how can we get him into a behavior modification school, that kind of thing. But it felt so bad for him because his attachment was set. That's the way he dealt with life. So we know secure attachment occurs, depending on the study you read, 50, 60, 65% of the time. These mothers are emotionally available, loving, and responsive. The infants are able to express their feelings openly with acceptance, and to know the mother will help regulate their distressed feelings. She's there when you need her. More control of impulse. These kids have more control of their impulses. They're more comfortable exploring their environment. They're open to learning. And generally they have good future relationships and development. The insecure avoidant, 15 to 20%, their mothers are emotionally unavailable, the infant frequently ignored, actively rejected, and the infant learns, I am not going to count on my caregiver. They're not available. And the infant's defensive strategy is to stay close so you don't get rejected, but if you get too close, mom's going to reject you or leave you. And then the ambivalent is only 10 to 15%. And these mothers are inconsistently responsive to the infant's attachment signals. So here you got a kid exploring on the bed, and mom has just tuned him out. So, and the disorganized is about 5%. Reactive attachment disorder is actually much less than that, very rare. Parental behavior, often frightening without solution for these kids. When we talk about circle of security, the safe haven, that is the mother, is also the source of their alarm. Often there's a history of parental unresolved trauma and direct maltreatment of the infant and child. The infant behavior, again, is come closer, go away, and when you see these kids in a strange situation, they want to go to mom, but they don't. And you get this kind of dance back and forth. So the infant behavior come closer, go away, they tend to dissociate, and they have a high incidence of aggression when they're older. And so the kid I was just telling you about in elementary school, basically at recess, he would go pick a fight with somebody. Or in the classroom, he would just totally disrupt whatever the teaching plan was. Okay, now we're going to talk about a concept called the social synapse. And this is going to gradually get us, into our neuroscience. If I were to recommend one book for you to read, and the last two slides in here have all the references. But this was published this year and it's called The Neuroscience of Human Relationships. And it's by Louis Cozzolino. And so this information, this concept I'm telling you, is right here in this book. But it's a very thorough read. It's easily read, not too confusing, not a lot of neuroscience in it, but alluded to. I think you would really enjoy that book. It would be a great reference book. So, the social synapse. You're familiar with how neurons synapse, pass information from one to another through their neurotransmitters. The good news is, I'm not going to put that slide on you. We're not going to get down in the weeds on that. But what I want you to understand, just as these neurons communicate with each other, there's communication across the synapse, and that changes the internal biochemistry of the next neuron. That activates your messenger RNA that now translates protein into new brain structure. So that's how our brains grow. But it starts at the neuronal level. The levels of information exchange are also taking place between individuals. My group of neurons in here, which is about 10 billion neurons, is interacting with yours. And so, if you can now put it on a more macro level, my neurons interact with your neurons. And so when we interact, we impart each other's internal biological state and influencing the long-term construction of each other's brains. So you can see as mother interacts with her new infant, and they get this dialogue going back and forth. This is how the baby's brain grows and begins to model and develop in relationship to mother's attachment pattern. Does that make sense? So the brain is a social organ of adaptation, and it's built through interaction with others. So the neural systems organize our attachment, our emotion, attunement, and social communication. The neural structures change, that's neuroplasticity, and we'll talk about that later, but they change with experience and social behavior. Now, are you guys, you ladies, familiar with Dr. Dan Siegel? You know about him? I've heard him at a half-day conference a few years ago, and he was awesome. His book that came out this year, The Yes Brain, I would highly recommend you read it. And or if you have a family that is, high school graduate, motivated, this is an excellent book about how to raise children. And, interacting with your partner, your mate, your wife, or husband. Just, there's a bunch of really great pearls of wisdom in there. But the metaphor he uses, I think, makes so much sense for us and to use it to explain to parents. So here we have a house under construction. Now, what they don't show here is a basement. So I'm going to say there's a basement. So the basement includes our spinal cord, the brainstem, which is the medulla and pons, and that basically covers your day-to-day heartbeat, respirations, blood pressure, all the stuff that you need to just live. The first floor is kind of it's not only the limbic system, but we'll talk about it later. It's a set of structures that interact with each other that process information in a very sophisticated way and then send it up to the cerebrum, to the neocortex, and let that make a decision about what way you're going. You know, do I go to Chick-fil-A for lunch or supper? Or it's that kind of thing. The most interesting thing, though, even though the first floor is pretty well complete, it's the second floor that's not built. And the second floor building is done by the parents and the environment. So, you know, if you're a secure attachment and you have this nice dialogue going on with your baby, you're going to construct it so the walls are plumb. It's according to blueprints. By the way, our blueprints are our genes. But environment can modify that structure, good or bad. So maybe the roof wasn't constructed the way it should have been and it leaks. Or the plumbing didn't go in quite right, or the electrical. So does that make sense? So really the parent's job is to construct that second floor. Now we're going to talk about the social brain. The human brain is crisscrossed with neural networks dedicated to receiving, processing, and communicating messages across the social synapse. Cerebral dominance. For social emotional functioning, the right side of the brain appears to be the dominant hemisphere in early life. Why? Because that side of your brain, the right side, does our relational stuff. You need to get attached. So you need that right side. The left hemisphere is the thinking side and undergoes modification and redevelopment throughout life. And language development is a stimulus for the left hemisphere growth. So the right it takes charge initially because you need to get attached. And then as that baby is learning to speak, the left side is coming on. I mean, it's always there, but I mean really maturing and functioning. Any questions about that? So the brain evolved to function within a matrix of other brains, is what I'm trying to say. But we know without mutually stimulating interaction, people and neurons wither and die. So neuronal death is called apoptosis. In humans, we see it as depression, grief, suicide. But there's also a phenomenon called pruning, and that's where you have neural connections that aren't being used anymore. And they don't exactly die, but they go away. They're just not used. And so the brain eventually gets rid of them. And the two big episodes of brain growth are that sort of birth to 4 or 5 and adolescence. So the expansion of the cortex in primates corresponds with increasing larger groups. This allows for safety in numbers, task specialization such as hunting, gathering, and caretaking. As the social brain grew, larger groups, social groups, and more complicated social groups evolved. So co-evolution of language and brain growth allowed for the development of higher levels of symbolic and abstract functioning. So the bottom line is that allowed us to begin to have a culture. The key to the mother's ability to attune to us and soothe our distress as her presence becomes synonymous with safety. So when you think of that caregiver and a secure attachment, it's because that baby feels safe. The infant survival is based on the abilities of the caretakers to detect the needs and intentions of the infant around them. So, as Casalino said in his book, the fitness in Darwin's terms is the ability to adapt to our environment. And I love this slide. We are not survival of the fittest. We are survival of the nurtured. Now, everybody's familiar with Maslow, correct? And what's interesting as you go through this, physiologic needs, safety, belongingness, love and needs, belongingness and love, esteem, those 4 levels are achieved within 2 to 3 years of age. I mean, the building blocks are there if you think about attachment. Physiologically, you feel like your needs are getting met. You feel safe and secure. You feel like you belong to this mother, this family, and you feel love. And because of that, you begin to feel really good about yourself and have confidence because your environment is breeding that. Does that make sense? So, secure attachment is adaptive in a safe environment, but it is maladaptive in an unsafe environment. So, if you have a secure attachment, and for whatever reason, you got to go and you're in a very good environment, and you got to go live with grandma who lives in the barrio, and it's not safe. You go walking around with your secure attachment, and you're used to engaging people with eye contact and face expression. Well, in some cultures, that'll get you in trouble. Likewise, if you have an insecure attachment and you are in a safe environment, you're going to have trouble making relationships if you're avoidant. If you're anxious, it's going to be problematic getting along with people. You're high maintenance. What is this all about? So we know information flows between the individuals across the social synapse, which we talked about, impacting the functioning and growth of the brain's neural circuits through our relationships. So the social brain is all about attaching, predicting, communicating. And because we have that ability, we have the most complex brains, humans do, in society of any animal on Earth. There's a physiologist by the name of McLean, who a number of years ago came up with this concept of the Triune Brain. And this is, number 1, the reptilian brain, that's the brainstem. Number 2, the paleo-mammalian, that's the limbic system, the midbrain. And the neo-mammalian cortex and prefrontal cortex. So, it's not quite an easy stretch just saying, we had these lower life forms, and they got better and better and better, and more brain, and they finally ended up humans. What's happened, particularly for us primates and as humans, is as the brain added layers of function, particularly for humans, each of those subsequent layers got more sophisticated than the animal prior. Does that make sense? Well, you have the spinal cord, then the brain stem, then sort of that mid-level brain that's just under the cortex, and then you have your cerebrum. So there's so many things that make us human, but a lot of our attachment system is in that part of our brain that's just below the cortex, just below the cerebrum. And our attachment system is far superior to many other animals. But you can look at chimpanzees and so forth, and they have an incredible attachment system. I saw a wonderful documentary on Jane Goodall and her life in Africa with the apes and the chimpanzees and so forth. And you, excuse me, really got a great understanding of what their social system was like, how they raised their young and so forth. So this little diagram gives you an idea. That pink area is your brainstem. There's some other primitive structures in that midbrain, but that mainly is your limbic system, which we'll talk about. And then you have our thinking part of the brain. That's the neocortex. I love this slide. So let me point it out to you if you haven't seen it. On the right side, everybody's having fun. They're out in the field. They're having picnics. They're flying kites. This is a great time. Over here on the left, what you see, actually it's on the right, but that's the left hemisphere. Everybody's in a cubicle farm. You know, it's all about analysis and facts and stuff like that. But what I find interesting, if you look real closely, you will see people escaping from that left side. They want to go over to the right side because that's more fun. It's more creative. Now, what's interesting about our brains is that we have not only vertical communication, that is from the spine up to the top, we have horizontal. The hemispheres communicate with each other through what? The corpus callosum. And we needed both sides of the brain to connect to really make us work. So the reptilian brain is faster than the limbic and the cortex brain. Much of the brain's functioning is based on unconscious fight or flight mechanisms as opposed to conscious or compassionate decision making. So, and I think you've all done this at one time, you accidentally touch a hot stove or something that's hot, and before you even know it, you have pulled your hand back and the pain starts. And then the brain kicks in like, that was stupid. Why did I do that? So your rational thinking part, if you really think about it, is usually a second or two behind what your body just responded to. And that's your reptilian brain. So the conscious and unconscious management of fear and anxiety is the core component of our attachment system. So, safety, survival, and reproduction. That's what your body is about. So, safety, survival, reproduction. So, we know though, if you get in that submit or freeze mode, this inhibits our language and speech. And if you're in a constant state of fear, decreased language development. Early implicit memories before the development of the hippocampus, which is our memory center, that doesn't come online until 2 to 3 years of age. And early implicit memories continue, and they're unconscious, continue to shape our experience and those of us throughout our lives. Now, as an example, one of the things I'm sure you've noted, have you ever said or done something, particularly with someone else, and you go, oh my God, where'd that come from? You know, maybe my parents said it or whatever, but it's kind of out of character for you, or it's just not who you think you are, but it happens. Does that happen to anybody here? I guess not. What has Okay. So sociostasis, this is one more concept, but they all kind of merge together. So the social synapse is the medium through which we're linked together into larger organisms such as families and the human species. The social brain is a social organ that connects with other brains to attune, communicate, and regulate one another. And sociostasis is how we regulate each other's internal biochemistry, emotions, and behavior by conscious and unconscious mechanisms. So sociostasis is kind of like homeostasis, where that's a regulation of your body, and we can regulate each other's internal biochemistry, emotions, and behavior. So it's really interesting. I assume you've had this experience where with a good friend or your partner that something happened and he or she is really upset about it. And you feel like the attack is coming to you personally. And the next thing you know, you two are right at each other. And it's like this dysregulation in this other person dysregulated you. Now the two of you are at an ugly point. So we're going to talk about that in a minute, about how our body does that. On the other hand, with that, if you can remain the calm one, and that other person is really mad, but you can remain calm, what does that do to them? Yeah. You're not throwing gasoline on the fire. So sociostasis is increased social support associated with cardiovascular health, immune system functioning, general health, mental health, cognitive function. The conclusion is relationships serve our physical health by regulating our emotions, metabolism, and immunologic functions. Married people live longer than singles because of that support. Now, what's interesting in mourning, the amount of amygdala activity, that's your fear center, correlates with the intensity of your sadness. So we can look at what strength of activity we're getting from the amygdala to look at our behavior. Okay, I think we need a break. What do you think?
Yes. Good.
Can we do, is 10 minutes long enough, 15 for a potty break? Okay. Okay. No? This is, I don't know, $15 on Amazon. And, I'm sorry, 18, but anyway. Bessel van der Kolk is a psychiatrist at Harvard, and his thing is trauma. And he really explains in this book how trauma affects your body. And this is such a good read. Now, even though I went to medical school and all that, I'm not a neurologist. I'm not a neurosurgeon. So just reading for this talk really brought me up to date on a lot of stuff. But when in doubt, you order Neuroscience for Dummies. Okay? And this was published in the last couple of years. It really will give you, in a very nice layman's language, lots of information about our nervous system. Okay, let's start with this next segment is on neuroscience, then we'll go to lunch. Okay? So there's some definitions I want you to know, some of which you probably know. ANS is the autonomic nervous system. SNS is sympathetic nervous system. PNS is parasympathetic nervous system. Now, two new terms you probably don't know. Dorsal vagal complex, ventral vagal complex. Are those new words for you? Okay. So if any of you are familiar with the polyvagal theory, this is in it. RSA is respiratory sinus arrhythmia. All that means is when you take a deep breath in, you get more blood in your chest and heart. Your heart has to speed up a little bit to pump it out. And when you exhale, the heart gets squeezed a little smaller, you have less blood to pump, and your pulse rate drops a little bit. So that's your respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And what drives that heartbeat is the electricity, the impulse coming down the vagus. It stops off in the heart and regulates your heartbeat. So I'll show you something in a moment that will explain that. Now, you all are aware of what we have in our body, on our nerves called myelin. Myelin's a fatty substance, and it's just like an electrical wire. If you coat it with that insulator, you can run that wire as long as you have the myelin. But if you don't have myelin, every time a nerve crosses that other nerve, you'd have a short circuit. So, and our brain is primarily made up of fat. But this allows for more efficient transmission of neural information. Okay, so let me explain this to you so you don't go to sleep right away. At the top is the high-risk infant, preemie, whatever you want to call it, and the bottom is the healthy one. And the top line of each one of those is the heartbeat. The bottom line with the black circles is the vagal tone. The only thing I want you to understand here is if you look at the amplitude, that is the range of high and low for vagal tone and for heart rate, compared in the upper to the lower, just looking at range and amplitude, which one has higher amplitude, higher range, more variability? The healthy one, right. And that's good because that means this baby is able to respond to its environment much better than that high-risk preemie. Does that make sense? Okay. So along that line, if we have the green is the window of tolerance. And as long as we function within that window of tolerance, we're going to be fine. We'll have homeostasis. But we know that when this exceeds that green stripe, I refer to this as a river. So the blue is one bank and the red's another bank, and the river flows through it, and that's green. So this person's doing okay. Whoops, now something has happened. And even though they have a fairly wide river, their hyperarousal gets triggered. And if this graph were to go on long enough, it would probably go into hypoarousal. So the hypoarousal is your submit or freeze. The hyperarousal is your fight or flight. So back to that infant we were talking about a moment ago. is that preemie had a very narrow window of tolerance.